Well, as Canadians, our history with residential schools has been on our minds and certainly in our hearts. And when we see those pictures and those clips online or on TV, they're so poignant for us to look at. There's a couple of slides to look at here of residential schools. This first slide is Port Alberni, the Port Alberni Residential School on Vancouver Island. And you see that the boys are on one side in this slide, and then on the next slide we see this picture of the girls on the other. Port Alberni was one of the bigger residential schools. It housed up to 400 children. This is the dining hall of that same school. The school was run by the United Church of Canada. I believe this picture was taken in the 1930s. Next slide is Trout Lake Residential School. And this is just east of North Bay in Ontario. And as you can see there, that school was run by the Roman Catholic Church. Next slide is Elkhorn in Manitoba, an Anglican-run school. And the size of that building is typical of residential schools, quite large. I believe that building would house up to 500 children. Last slide is Crow's Stand Residential School in Saskatchewan, and this was Presbyterian run. We know that 130 schools ran in Canada, and we know now that those schools saw 150,000 children between the years of 1880 and right into the 1960s. Well, beginning this afternoon, I'm a commissioner at our General Assembly meeting. And General Assembly is our national church meeting that happens once a year. And typically, we would meet in person. There would be about 300 delegates to the meetings. And we make, as a national church, decisions for our denomination at that meeting. And there are usually about 300 people. Clergy people, elders, and church staff. Well, we're not able to meet in person, so we begin this afternoon online. We talk about some interesting things at General Assembly. For instance, we talk about the relationship between Palestine and Israel, and that's been on the news lately, and our denomination is very careful not to take a side, but to try to be a vehicle that would lead both of those nation states to live in peace together. Certainly issues around LGBTQ we will be discussing at this general meeting, and we'll be talking about what it looks like for us to be an affirming church, and I will be speaking to you about that in weeks coming up subsequent to the meeting. But what I want to look at today with you revolves around these issues around our Indigenous people and the sad history that we all have as Canadians that has been becoming increasingly poignant just even over these last couple of weeks. And secondly, I also want to talk about an issue that dovetails so closely with the issues of Indigenous people. And this issue has to do with the uniqueness of Jesus Christ for salvation. It asks the question, is it necessary to go through Jesus to be a saved person? And if it is, what does that mean for us? And how does that affect the way that we relate to people around us? And I'm going to give you an equation that I believe will be helpful for all of us. It's not a mathematical equation, it's a theological equation. It's if this is true, and if this is true, then this must be true. And I'll give you that in just a few minutes. See, this issue of how we have treated our Indigenous people and the uniqueness of Jesus for salvation, they're so closely linked together. Because if we believe that Jesus is the only way to God, then we have a calling to somehow take that to other people. I mean, certainly that was the thinking of our European forefathers. This thinking that our God is right and your God is wrong. So we want to give you our God and we want to take away your God. The other Christian call that comes into all of this is this call: go and make disciples of all nations. Jesus said this to his followers: take who I am and take what I've taught into the world. And as Christians, we believe that Jesus said that, and we believe that he commanded us to do that. But if we don't understand this command of Jesus properly and correctly, there will be tragic consequences. And the pictures we just looked at are proof of those consequences if we misunderstand this call of Jesus to go and make disciples of all nations. And so I want to look at these two things today as we struggle with this issue. Jesus is the only way is one, and go and make disciples. And not just as it relates to our indigenous peoples, but as it relates to all peoples in Canada, all peoples of different race, different backgrounds, and different religions. It is such a big deal to people when they hear the words, Jesus is the only way to God, and because of that, you go out and you change people and make them into disciples. It's a big deal to people to hear that, not just to Christian people, but to all people. I was at a party once a couple of years ago, back when we used to be able to have parties. And I was introduced to a couple, and I was introduced as, this is Tim, he's a minister in town. Oh, you're a minister, yeah. And typically what happens to me is that people take a step back as soon as they find out that I'm a minister in a church. And oftentimes, I wonder why, but then when I consider how Christians can be, the answer to that is less mysterious. So I'm introduced to these people, and we're chatting, and they start to talk about how they have sailed around the world, and how they have just been privileged to be able to do that, and consequently, they have met people of all kinds of different faith systems, Buddhists and Muslims, and Hindi people. And the woman, as we chatted at this birthday party, said to me, because of all that connection with all those different people who I got to know as being good people, I just can't understand how anyone can say there is only one way to God. And she was very gentle and kind about it. It wasn't a venomous conversation. It was a beautiful day. It was a birthday party. There was a cake ready to be cut. But that's the question, isn't it? How can we say that there is only one way to God, but yet as Christians believe that is what Jesus said? That I am the way, the truth, and the life, and there is only one way to God, and it's through me. How we think about this is so important. Wrong thinking has left sad and tragic evidence in our history with our native peoples. And it's actually, and we know this, it's way bigger than our national history as Canadians. It's an issue of colonialism. Colonialism lasted 500 years. And it was this way of thinking that says, in very simple terms, we're right and you're wrong. What we do is better than what you do, so we're going to change you. Our God is better than your God, so we're going to give you our God and we're going to take away your God. It happened in India. It happened in Vietnam. It happened all across South America. It happened in North Africa and in South Africa. It happened across the Caribbean. It happened in the United States. You could add to that list. And here in this beautiful and blessed country of Canada, in the lives of 150,000 children who didn't grow up with their parents, because the leadership of this country believed that we have the right way. I want to show you some words from Paul. You've heard these words just a few minutes ago that Gord read. Paul was so convinced that all people in the whole world needed to know about who Jesus was, that he left Jerusalem and he traveled all the way to Italy, which is mind-boggling to think that 2,000 years ago he was able to do that. And in one story, he traveled to Athens, and he was sitting in a marketplace in Athens, in Greece, surrounded by people of different faiths. And all the people would ask him, "What do you believe, Paul?" And Paul said, "I believe in Jesus." And they would say, "Well, who is Jesus? Show us who Jesus is." And Paul says, "I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, and that Jesus is my Savior." And they said, "Well, show us that way." And Paul spoke and then wrote the words that are so famous now. "I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongue of men or of angels but do not have love, I'm like a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, and if I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, even if I have faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing." Love for Paul was everything. Do you notice that Paul doesn't say, even if I had faith enough to move a mountain but do not have Jesus? He says, but do not have love. Why? Because Paul is not trying to divide people. He's trying to unite people. For Paul, Jesus is love, and God is love. They are one and the same for Paul. But Paul did not say, "You need Jesus." Paul said to them, "You need love." He's bringing forward something to all these people who are coming from all kinds of different faiths and religions. And he's laying on the table something right in front of them that he knows is the common thread that runs between all people and all races and all backgrounds and all belief systems and all religions. It's love. We need to live love in our lives. It was the most important thing to Jesus. And Paul knew that when different people recognize this common thread that runs through everything, they will then recognize that they have a common bond and that they're worshiping the same thing. Well, then people say, "Well, what is your love, Paul? Love could mean anything. What does love mean to you?" And Paul goes on to give us this very precise and exact definition of what the love of God is. Love is patient, love is kind. Many of you don't even have to read these words. You know them. Love doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud. Love does not dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongdoings. In that church in Corinth, in Greece, Paul was dealing with a church that was not unified. And so Paul is saying to them, look, just because some of you speak in tongues doesn't mean you're holier than the others who don't speak in tongues. And Paul says, look, just because some of you give more doesn't mean you're holier than the people that don't. And just because some of you have more education, you see, even in Paul's church, people were different. And Paul said to them, you need love. Like, what's the point of believing in something if it divides you? Without love, you're nothing. Without love, you'll be divided. And in the marketplace, to all these different people from different places and different religions, Paul is saying, what good is my belief? And what good is your belief if it leaves us divided? You believe what you believe, you do what you do what you think is right, but can we agree? Can we agree that it has to be in the framework of this kind of love? The love that does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. And many people in that marketplace would have said to Paul, yes, love has to be the key when we speak of God. When I pray, I visualize Jesus when I pray. And I visualize a table with a chair and then another chair. And Jesus is sitting in one chair, and I just walk up to the table and I sit in the other chair, and it's just me and Jesus talking. That's how I pray. And sometimes I come and I lay stuff on that table that is just heavy in my life, and Jesus just accepts it. And sometimes I come to that table and I'm crying. I am just weeping. And Jesus weeps with me, and he takes that, he accepts it. And sometimes I come to that table in prayer and I am just overjoyed because I'm celebrating something in my life that I recognize as being so good and just directly from God. And Jesus and I at that prayer table celebrate together and we laugh together. And that relationship I have with Jesus who revealed God is so intimate and it's so precious to me. And that faith is so important to me. But Paul said, what good is that faith if you get up from that prayer table and then live a life that is not full of love for all people? What good is it? It is nothing. It doesn't mean anything if you can't figure out how to live love. And so here's the equation I want to give you. It's so important to understand this because if we get this wrong, there can be tragic consequences in our country and in our families and in our world. Here's the first part of the equation. Jesus is the way. We believe this as Christians because Jesus said it. Jesus is the only way. Here's the second part of the equation. We believe that Jesus is the full expression of God. Jesus said, when you're looking at me, you're looking at God. So what that means is Jesus is the only way, yes. Also, the God of Jesus is the only way. So if this is true, then this must be true. If it's true that Jesus is the only way, then the God of Jesus is the only way. You're with me so far. Here's the third part of the equation. The simplest definition of God in the Bible, Gord McCallum read just a minute ago. It's from the Apostle John when he gives us this definition of God that is 3 words. God is love. Because people say, well, if the God of Jesus is the only way, what way is that? It's love. Love and God are interchangeable. Jesus and love are interchangeable. It's love that's the only way. What if you were to substitute the word Jesus with the word love? Love is the only way. And you say, well, what does love mean? Paul gives us a definition of love that is precise and it's exact. And as Christians, we believe it's that love that is the only way. And the most beautiful thing is that people of all faiths will sit down at that table, see that common thread, and they'll say, that's my God too. Hindi, Buddhists, Muslims, and indigenous people will see that love is the only way. If you don't know what love is, you can't know what God is. And if you don't live that kind of love in your life, you can't get to where God is. And that's the common thread that will unite all people. I just leave you with this quote. In 1883, Sir Hector Langevin, who was the Secretary of State for the Canadian provinces, tells Parliament this. In order to educate the children properly, he's talking about Indigenous children, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. They just got it wrong. They got it wrong. It's not because they knew Jesus, but it's because they really didn't know Jesus. On some level, they thought that they were bringing God to the indigenous peoples of this country and of this land. They didn't recognize that God was already here. Of course, God was already here. Love was all around. Family love, community love, the strong helping the weak, communion with the earth, communion with the Great Spirit. The love that Paul defines in 1 Corinthians 13 that is so exact and precise was here. The colonialists didn't see it. God was already here and they just walked right by him. And so here's one way of looking at this. And some Christians wouldn't agree with this, but a lot of Christians would. Ask the question, are you my sister and my brother? Are you part of my family? In order to find the answer to that question, we have to ask another question. Do you live this love in your life? Do you live this kind of love in your life? We have the definition of that love. This is what defines our God. Patience, kindness, not self-seeking, but humble, not proud, never rejoicing in evil. Are you living this love? And if the answer is yes, then we're brothers, we're sisters, we're all in the same family, we're living the same God in our lives. For people who aren't living in that way, for people who live by the command instead of greed and ego and arrogance and hatred, then the great prophet who Christian people follow that we call Jesus, Jesus would say, it's to those people that you need to go out and make disciples of them. You need to go out and make those people into disciples of love. And all people of all faith systems and all religions can step back and say, that's what I believe. Let's all go together and make people into disciples of this love. That just makes sense for people. It makes sense for people all around the world who may have different structures of faith systems and different religions. And together we say, today, for the sake of all that's sacred and for the sake of all that's holy, if God is already there, please don't try to make them speak in exactly the way you speak. I don't know why. My ancestors, my people, my blood couldn't get this right. I don't know why. And I don't have an answer for that. But for today, our hope together is in knowing that it's that same love that can make it right once again.